and our guest speaker is tonight. We're pleased to have Mr. Dr. Peter Hobbins, and his talk will be entitled Faith and Fidelity, and talking about the RAAF's early embrace of flight simulation. So without further ado, Peter, I'll just hand over to you, and I look forward to taking a seat and hearing your discussion. Many thanks.
Well, thanks, Dave, for that introduction. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you tonight from Dulwich Hill up in Sydney, which was a meeting place for the Gadigal, Bidjigal and Wangal peoples. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Look, as an AHSA member, I'm delighted to be presenting to you tonight, and also to the Friends of Air Force History and Heritage. And I'm particularly proud of Squadron Leader Anna Williams and everything she's achieved, particularly in the last year. So well done, Anna. Look, if you've seen me presenting on flight simulators before, don't worry. I've got almost everything tonight is new, even some of the bad jokes. Now, you're all fans of RAAF history, so there's no need for me to say too much about the early years of aviation. And of course, as you know, Australia's first flying squadron was established on Sydney Harbour. And I'm not going to hear a word out of you Victorians about Point Cook, because of course I'm referring to the Sydney Flying Squadron that was established here in 1891. And there'll be a few more maritime digs at you as So to return a little bit more to reality, from the establishment of the Central Flying School in 1914 at Point Cook, many Australian pilots actually had to deploy overseas to complete their advanced training. And again, one of my other pet subjects, troop ships, came to the fore in sending the Australian Flying Corps overseas. But of course, that was a slow and costly process that really punctuated World War I. The other alternative at the time, of course, and really up until the 1930s, was to import training aircraft and expertise from overseas. Even into the late 1930s, most of the aircraft that came to Australia arrived by sea. And again, yeah, sorry, I do work at the Maritime Museum. I've got to put a few ship photos in there for you. But the bigger point that I want to make is that when you look at aircraft like the Airlines of Australia Douglas DC-3 on the left of the screen here, it speaks to a time in the late 1930s when there was a massive growth in the complexity of aviation, not just the aeroplanes themselves, but also their instruments and the ground-based navigational aids that aided what was then called blind flying, but of course now we tend to refer to as instrument flight rules. But that same year where the Douglas airliners really gained ascendancy, we also saw Australia's very first link trainer imported. It didn't belong to the Royal Australian Air Force, but was actually brought in by Australian National Airways and installed at Essendon Airport. Although in that same year, 1937, Squadron Leader Fred Shergar had been in the United States, and he recommended that the RAAF should purchase one of these new link trainers, both for civil and for military use. Now, at the same time, it was found that the Royal Air Force in Britain had ordered 50 Type C of these link trainers. And so one of those was taken off the RAF indent and sent to Australia. Now, typical with RAF priorities before the war, it took a full year before the British order was filled and the Australian one was sent off, but it gradually arrived at Point Cook late in 1938. And almost all of the link trainers that you see in that pre-war and wartime era around the British Empire were actually not built in the United States, but Link's subsidiary factory in Ontario, which was of course a way of spending pounds within the British Empire rather than having to pay in American dollars. Now, the link trainer, and you can see a very good description of how it worked in this 1939 illustration. It wasn't what we would these days call a flight simulator. It was really more of a training aid. It was primarily designed to teach pilots to fly according to their instruments, but it did also increasingly teach them radio technique, radio navigation aids, and also discipline in actually following orders while they were flying their fake aeroplane. But I think the other point I'd like to point out here is in the middle of the screen, you can see that right from the very outset of the link trainer, it was connected with a forensic tracing device. In other words, a little movable trolley that recorded the flight path of the trainer. That little device was known as a crab. And so you could argue that, in fact, link trainers and other flight simulators pioneered what were later called flight data recorders 20 to 30 years before they were installed in mainstream flying aeroplanes. Now, the link trainer operated by a bellows-driven motion system that moved it around in circles, helped to bank and turn, climb and dive. And it was sold as being very faithful facsimile of real atmospheric flight. And the link trainer really relied on a servo-mechanical system that produced a whole series of computations that linked the pilot's control inputs to the movement of the trainer on that octagonal base. But nevertheless, there was no vision system. The pilot had to sit with a hood closed so that they were basically flying literally in the dark and had to require their imagination to think through the course that they were flying according to their instruments. And certainly when the Chief of the Air Staff, Air Vice Marshal Richard Williams, sat in ANA's link trainer in 1937, he refused to have the hood closed on him, and he refused to have his flying prowess evaluated by the link device. But nevertheless, by the start of World War II, the RAAF had a link trainer on every one of its stations. And by 1940, there were 21 of them in Air Force service, at which time a link trainer instructor mustering was created and the first training course was set up. But I think it's fair to say that almost unanimously, pilots and trainees hated what they considered spending time in this link's horror box, as they called it. But the advent of war in September 1939 really escalated the demands on the RAAF in unprecedented ways, not just for the number of aeroplanes it required, but on all the supplies like fuel, as well as servicing and therefore maintenance personnel as well. And one of the key areas where the Air Force was wasting those resources was in training. It led to massive losses in aircraft as pilots and other aircrew learned their craft, as well as, of course, all the other resources that went with them. And not surprisingly, the RAAF's losses reached a peak after the Pacific War opened in December 1941, so that in the year 1942, there were 1,312 accidents right across the Royal Australian Air Force. And that was certainly a loss of airframes, but of course it also had a human cost as well, which in turn had a very negative public relations effect on the Air Force, including recruiting, but also was detrimental to the war effort, with families feeling that their sons' lives had gone in vain. That in itself prompted a whole series of initiatives from the Directorate of Training, as well as the establishment of a Directorate of Flying Safety late in the war in July 1945. None of that stopped, though, the massive throughput of trainees that was required to service Australia's commitment to the Empire Air Training Scheme, something that Squadron Leader Williams can give you a chapter and verse on, as well as the local needs of the RAAF here in Australia and the Southwest Pacific Theatre. And yet throughout the war, it was still RAAF policy that up to 30% of trainee aircrew would be scrubbed during the course of that process. So not only were links used as training tools, but they were also used as an initial screening mechanism to winkle out some of those people like me who probably don't have a very good sense of coordination and shouldn't be entrusted with the command of a flying aeroplane. And so if you look at this photo of the link trainer room at Point Cook in 1943, you can see by the middle of the war, the training system was highly industrialised, being trained individually, one per link trainer, with the hardworking instructors over on the right there. And to give you some idea, link trainer utilisation varied between about 7.5 hours per day to up to 12 hours per day through the latter years of the war. And to keep that level of serviceability up meant the services of the rather unsung Directorate of Technical Services, who really worked night and day, particularly to keep out dust and to repair all the complex servo-mechanical mechanisms. And one of the really key people in the DTS was Warrant Officer Tom Keck, who became one of the RAAF's key link trainer and simulator personnel. Now, the RAAF wasn't alone in its embrace of these sorts of training aids. And in fact, in 1943, the Directorate of Training remarked that, quote, synthetic training is enjoying quite a vogue both in England and America, end quote. Certainly, the training aids used by the RAAF had also escalated beyond the link trainer that included bombing trainers, navigation trainers, gunnery aids, as well as even radar trainers, particularly for the H2S system. Also, at least 32 of the link trainers imported into Australia were converted to what is known as an Edmondes deflection trainer to teach fighter pilots basic deflection gunnery. And I'm really grateful to Andrew Curtis, who's been researching the history of 2 operational training unit for his work on the Edmondes conversions that he's managed to track down. Also at Jervis Bay, the base torpedo unit had one of these devices on the right, known as a Crail torpedo attack trainer. A similar sort of principle to the link, but of course you can imagine it was designed to teach pilots effectively deflection, airborne launching of torpedoes. There's very little documentation left about that one Crail in Australia, and I've been dealing with my Fleet Air Arm colleagues to see if we can pin down any more documentation. The only thing I can say is that after the war, there was some attempt to convert it to firing, well, to simulating the firing of rocket projectiles, but I think that project died and the device was uninstalled in 1947. But we've been looking really at single place trainers. And as the war progressed, of course, the RAAF brought more and more multi-place types into its inventory. And I'm thinking here of Lockheed Hudson's, Bristol Beaufort's, North American Mitchells and Consolidated Liberators. And of course, the crash of any one of those aircraft could lead to a large loss of aircrew. Now, partly the safety and efficiency of multi-place aircrew training was enhanced by what these days might be called crew resource management. At the time, it was sometimes called crew integration training. And that was really driven at the operational training unit level. But again, when you start to have very large aeroplanes using large amounts of petrol and requiring huge amounts of maintenance, you can imagine how costly that was to the RAAF. So one way around that was to try to find ground-based training devices. There were some attempts at this using the existing link trainer system. So for instance, if you see this diagram for 4 operational training unit at Williamtown, they actually on their own initiative linked 2 link trainers together to coordinate navigation and signals methodologies. But of course, as you can see, however ingenious it was still 2 individual trainees sitting in 2 individual trainers with 2 control desks as well. So it was still quite small scale. So really most of the aircrew who were going to be operating in these multi-place aircraft, particularly in the European Air War, were the Empire Air Training Scheme trainees who departed in the fast, efficient and frequent air services that were introduced during World War II. Oops, actually, no, they weren't. The RAAF still had to rely heavily on the Merchant Navy and its troop ships throughout World War II. So better luck next war, chaps. But these crews who were sailing on troop ships like the Awatea here were heading off either to Canada, where they went to the operational training units, or to Britain, where they learned in the heavy conversion units before they were deployed over Europe. And that sort of training was absolutely necessary to form a cohesive, combat-ready crew. And it was while they were overseas, particularly in Canada and Britain, that many RAAF trainees first encountered Link's new celestial navigation trainer, which was first demonstrated in Ontario at the Link factory there in 1941. Now, the CNT, as it was known, came out of an RAF request from 1939, and it was actually designed by Ed Link himself, who you can see here on the left, and really incorporated the celestial navigation expertise of Captain Philip Williams. And if you look at his uniform, you notice he's a naval officer. Keep plugging away at that Maritime link. And the CNT was designed not just to teach celestial navigation to aviators, but also to provide an opportunity for bombing instruction, as well as particularly crew integration and procedural training as well. The Royal Air Force loved it, and in fact, they ordered 100 of them, which also went to Fleet Air Arm bases in the UK as well. The Royal Canadian Air Force picked up another 20 for its contribution to the Empire Air Training Scheme. And after December 1941, both the United States Army Air Corps and United States Navy also ordered their own, or they also seem to have picked up some of the RAF orders. So not all 100 ordered for Britain seem to have made it across the Atlantic. But what actually was the CNT? Well, I'm glad you asked. The Link AN-2554-1 was effectively an entire structure that required steel framing that was concreted into the ground aligned with local magnetic north. It was then housed within an octagonal silo that was clad in a non-metallic coating, so as not to interfere with navigational instruments. And as you can see in the middle picture on the bottom right, there was also an air conditioning plant that was necessary, not so much for the comfort of the personnel, but to make sure that the elaborate device could actually work in all weather conditions. Now, by 1944, many Australian Empire Air Training Scheme trainees were spending up to 3 hours in training sessions in silos like this one at RCAF stations in Canada, as well as RAAF OTUs in Britain. Inside the CNT, it looked a little bit like this. It basically used 379 light globes to represent the major Northern Hemisphere constellations, and some of the stars were also collimated. There was the instructors could use to control the brightness of the stars, and they allowed for the solving of navigational problems anywhere between a latitude of 36 to 86 degrees north. This is what it looked like when the lights were turned on. By 1945, the US Navy had also come up with an artificial sun to allow for daytime navigational exercises as well. And in addition to all of these, the simulator came as standard with an engine noise simulator, with the potential to add clouds, to add lightning, and even to bump the cockpit section up and down to simulate turbulence. So of course, Link sold this as being the next best thing to the real thing. Now, by January 1943, RAAF headquarters in Washington, DC had got wind of the CNT and recommended ordering 2 of them for Australia. I think, as usual, the RAAF didn't want to look like they were technologically backwards and wanted to hop on that particular bandwagon. In July 1943, 3 of the CNTs were requested not from Link, but actually off the RAF's order as well. Now, they came at a price of £14,000 each, so including freight, the total bill was £60,200. To put that into some context, the latest model Link trainer, the ANT-18, was priced at £3,000 Australian, while DAP Beaufort built in Australia came in at about £44,000. So in other words, for the price of just more than one Beaufort, you've got 3 CNTs shipped to Australia. And that was certainly seen as a major cost efficiency in terms of ground-based training. But before the CNTs were dispatched to Australia, Warrant Officer Tom Keck and Flying Officer Arthur Sandell, who was a navigator, were sent off to Binghamton, which was the main headquarters for Link, as well as Tom Keck went down to Texas to see one of those silos actually being built before they came back to Australia to help with the installation and operation of the RAAF's 3 examples. But one other thing they made sure of before they left the United States was that the 3 sent to Australia were unique in that the star globes were repositioned to recreate the Southern Hemisphere setup. And so I believe that the RAAF Museum has the only surviving copy of the Southern Hemisphere manual for the CNT anywhere in the world. You can see the dome was actually made out of chicken wire, and it rotated to simulate the movement of the Earth as well as the so-called aircraft's track. And you can see the aircraft cockpit section looked a little bit like the forward fuselage of a supermarine walrus. But it wasn't just a navigation trainer. It also had a major projector underneath that projected onto a silk screen that showed aerial photography of the continental United States. So that permitted the navigators on board to undertake daytime navigation, as well as you can see in the middle photo here, bomb aiming as well, where they actually took over control just as a real bomb aimer would in an operational aeroplane. The RAAF was hoping to replace these American plates with Australian aerial photography, but it turned out to be too expensive. So anyone who trained in the CNT at East Sale would have probably been flying over Missouri or something like that. Now, the 3 CNTs that were ordered arrived in Melbourne by ship in May 1944. And in addition to their purchase costs, they also required another £8,000 to build each of the 3 silos. Now, although there's a bit of a misnomer in the literature that goes back to the 1960s, I've never seen any archival documentation that refers to these devices as A63 in the RAAF's second A series. Certainly happy to be corrected if you can pin down any paperwork in that respect. But as far as I can see, there was never any other serial number attached to these 3 CNTs, except for those from the original RAAF order. And they were often referred to as LCTs, or link crew trainers, in that setting. So the only numbers I can give you for those 3 different devices are these. British order number 94 was sent to 1 operational training unit at East Sale in Victoria. British LCT number 95 was sent to 7 OTU at RAAF Mines in New South Wales. To 7 OTU at Tocumwal in New South Wales. And British order number 96 was sent to 3 OTU at RAAF Mines up here in New South Wales. The only example of the 3 CNTs the RAAF ordered that ever actually became operational was the one at East Sale, which came online in March 1945. And it seemed to sort of erratically get a workout, depending very much on how many trained staff there were available at East Sale. But one of the problems, of course, was that as the heavens shifted, the celestial projection in the chicken wire dome became more and more inaccurate over time. So rather than trying to fix that, the School of Air Navigation plotted a new series of exercises in 1949 based on the 1945 star positions. But by 1956, that workaround was no longer feasible. And so in 1957, it was decided that the East Sale example should no longer be maintained. So the CNT that once had the British serial number of 94 was auctioned off and dismantled after August 1962. Up at RAAF Mines, the silo itself was completed by the end of the war in August 1945. However, the CNT itself was not installed. In fact, it remained on the base in crates until 1948, when it was about 40% assembled. But then that process was cancelled in 1949 with the shift away from flying boat operations for maritime patrol. In 1953, the silo from RAAF Mines was shipped over to Fremantle so that it could be set up at RAAF base Pearce. But in the end, it wasn't erected and it was eventually declared obsolete. So in September 1954, the CNT numbered 96 in the British system was auctioned off at RAAF Mines, but it wasn't auctioned in Perth. So that became a bit confusing. Let me go on and I'll try to explain that. When you look at the Tocumwal example, that silo was also completed by Victory in the Pacific Day in 1945. But again, the CNT wasn't actually erected inside the silo at any stage. It was sent down to East Sale in about 1949 and then shipped over to Perth in 1950. So in fact, CNT 95 from the British order was auctioned at 10 Stores Depot in Merredin, Western Australia in September 1954. So let me just clarify this for you. The RAAF Mines silo was sold in RAAF Mines. So no, the RAAF Mines silo was shipped to Pearce and sold in Perth. The RAAF Mines CNT remained in place at RAAF Mines and was auctioned off there. The Tocumwal CNT was shipped to East Sale and then Perth and was auctioned off in Western Australia. But just to complete the picture, the Tocumwal silo wasn't sold in Tocumwal. It was actually shipped up to Brisbane in 1949 and then taken up to Amberley in 1951, where it was found to be in such a poor state of repair that it was scrapped in 1954. So these were some of the efficiencies of the post-war Royal Australian Air Force. And in fact, I guess they speak somewhat to the RAAF's underwhelming engagement with this novel training aid. But I would argue, and I'm certainly keen to get your thoughts on this, that in 1945, perhaps with the exception of visiting United States Army Air Force B-29s, the Link Celestial Navigation Trainer was perhaps the highest technology artefact anywhere on the Australian continent. And however badly the RAAF used it over those years, you could certainly say that by the end of World War II, the service was totally committed to what was then known as synthetic training. It ended the war with 136 link trainers, and it amassed about 700,000 training hours in those links. And yet, nevertheless, with post-war demobilisation, the link trainer instructor mustering was deleted in 1946, and instead flying instructors were expected to conduct what was called all-through training, which meant getting their trainees not only in link trainers, but getting them up in the air as well. And as you can imagine, both the instructors and the trainees did their best to avoid getting into the links if they could at all do so. Now, the end of the war, of course, saw the RAAF with far too many link trainers. So 51 of their Type Ds were auctioned off in 1947 at about £80 each, which is a huge discount on their original price. And another 31 were given to Air Training Corps units, where, of course, they were a massive treat right up until the 1970s, even the 1980s, when I remember having one when I was a young Air League cadet. They were sold off to businesses, amusement parks, former RAAF personnel, and also aero clubs around the country. And I think they really did help kickstart post-war aviation right around Australia. So the link trainers were remaining in the RAAF were standardised on the D2 model, but particularly the A&T 18 ones. But even they were starting to get a bit clapped out by the 1950s and posed increasingly difficult maintenance problems as that decade went on. But nevertheless, giving some idea of how important they were seen to the RAAF, 2 of them were shipped over with 81 wing to Iwakuni in Japan, and at least one of those 2 was an Edmondi's deflection trainer for training Mustang pilots in deflection shooting. Meanwhile, in 1947, Qantas picked up a couple of link trainers that were ex-Air Force, at least initially. And I'm wondering how many of you out there have sharp eyes and can spot the deliberate mistake in this picture. I'm not talking about the serial number on the tail. Yes, all right, I've cheated a little bit with the branding there. ANA also employed an ex-RAAF link in the early years after the war, but certainly by the late 1940s, all of the major Australian airlines had ordered their own link-style trainers, either from the United States or from Britain. And of course, wartime had drastically escalated again the complexity of aircraft and the amount of instrumentation they carried both on the air and linked into on the ground. And that led to a process of development in procedures and drills and checklists that are so familiar to today's pilots. But at the same time, of course, there was the harsh realities of economics in the civil aviation sphere, as well as the massive cuts in defence spending after the end of World War II, which meant that flying time was a very rare commodity, both in the airlines and in the Air Force. And so it was in the context of looking for cheaper alternatives to flying time that in 1948, the RAAF established what they called the Synthetic Training Panel, which amongst its members was Warrant Officer Tom Keck, the link trainer expert. So, of course, that problem with limited flying time reduced the proficiency of many Air Force flyers, but at the same time, it also had the statistical artifact of appearing to exaggerate accident rates. In other words, when you have one accident against a very small number of flying hours, it looks far worse than when you have many accidents against many flying hours. Having said that, the very worst accident statistic in the RAAF's entire history didn't come during the Second World War, but it was in February 1947 when the Air Force was doing barely any flying. And you can see in this period chart that fatal accidents escalated with the adoption of new technologies, particularly jet-powered aircraft like the DH Vampire, as well as the onset of the Korean War in 1950. And in fact, the fatal accident rate during 1950 was almost as bad as the peak years of World War II. Now I'm going to thank Maurice Austin for this little bit of footage here. I'll see if I can turn off the noise. You can go down and see this at Werribee if you want, if it's operating one day. The thing is, the link trainer didn't disappear after World War II. That servo-mechanical technology continued to be developed in the post-war years, particularly through this company here, Air Trainers, who were based in the UK. Now, they sold off a model they called the AT22, which was a generic piston engine trainer that was adopted by the RAAF as the D4 Mark I. And the RAAF also ordered 10 of those, as well as another 10 of the AT50 model, known as the D4 Mark II, which was meant to be a jet procedural trainer. Now, these 2 types from Air Trainers were the last link-style devices ordered by the RAAF, and the final one of those was delivered in 1955. Now, these links were still generic devices, but they were increasingly being sold by the rhetoric of calling them simulators, which was a little bit of a dodge, really, but you can see where the field was going. Although the processing speed of their servo-mechanical instruments could be, escalated a little bit, they really struggled to emulate the performance of jets like the Meteor Mark FH. And ultimately, they were still seen very much as a procedural skills trainer rather than what we would now term a flight simulator. Which leads me on to that precise definition. So by the late 1940s, both the Americans and the British were rapidly moving towards a drastically new approach in ground-based flying training. The US Navy tended to call these devices operational flight trainers, while the US Air Force, newly created in 1948, preferred the terminology flight simulator. And as we know, that's the one that's really stuck. Rather than a servo-mechanical device, these were powered by analog computers that solved differential equations in real times. And that technology was actually developed from wartime anti-aircraft and naval fire control systems designed to plot and then shoot down enemy aircraft. One of the other major differences, of course, was that simulators were meant to simulate a very specific aircraft type, both in terms of its layout as well as its performance envelope. Now, in the UK, this new approach was known as a Siloth trainer, named after the RAAF station where they were first experimented with. The original model was a defunct Lockheed Hudson fuselage, but then the RAF moved on to the Handley Page Halifax as a way of teaching air crews to integrate the mechanical, pneumatic and electronic systems aboard its large multi-place aircraft. And these sorts of trainers helped teach aircrew about flight procedures and crew integration that were installed at various OTUs around Britain during World War II. In the United States, the same sorts of devices had been developed, and they were often known as Demel trainers or Demel simulators, named after the engineer Richard Demel, who worked for Bell Telephone Company, completely unrelated to Bell Aircraft Corporation, where he developed what he called the Z1 model, which was meant to be a facsimile trainer of the US Navy's SNJ Texan Advanced Trainer aircraft. Now, the aircraft company of Curtiss Wright leapt onto this new technology and focused particularly in the United States Navy as a major customer, developing its initial simulator for the Martin PBM Mariner, and then others for the Convair PBY-1 Liberator and PBY-2 Privateer that you can see in this rather dodgy illustration here. But I like this picture because it gives you a sense of the size and scale of American innovation here. Not only did it involve a complete facsimile crew station, including turrets, but also a massive computer bank and what was known as the troubles panel, where both problems and plots could be monitored by the instructors up there. But these new simulators went one step better as well, because they were actually designed to replicate the performance envelope of a particular aircraft type. It meant that they could also be used by aeronautical engineers in thinking about the aeroplane itself. And the Privateer is a great example where its original twin fin configuration led to lots of directional stability problems. So the simulator, the very early simulator, was used to model potential impacts of different tail surfaces until you got to the very large vertical stabilizer seen on the final production PV4Y2 model. Now, modelling those specific aircraft types certainly made it easier in the early days of computing to come up with a device that could actually manage that number of equations at the same time. The US Navy was one of the major adopters, and I think that was partly because of the critical role of learning management of early turbine engines that took a while to spool up while practicing carrier landings. But the US Navy also embraced the idea of mobility through creating these trailer-based systems, for instance, for the F9F Panther and the F2H Banshee. But have a look and see that the illustration on the right shows that these simulators had opaque canopies because despite the advanced computer technology, there was no way they could come up with an effective visual system. So in a sense, the pilots in these were still flying blind, just as they had done in the previous link trainers. So at the same time as these simulators were really starting to come online with the US services, the Korean War drove home to the RAAF its relatively poor standards of pilot training that had come out of the austerity of the post-war years. And in particular, what Richard Creswell, the wing commander who'd led 77 Squadron and came back to reevaluate them in 1953, what he noted was that the RAAF was not making very good use of the many all-weather operational aids that were in place across the Korean Peninsula and weren't really treating their aircraft as full weapon systems in the way that they really ought to be. And in fact, Creswell said that he actually sent home 11 young Air Force pilots because he basically felt they weren't up to flying in a combat theatre. So when he came home, he urged that the RAAF should upgrade its fighter syllabus to the same standard as the United States Air Force. But as many of us will know, the Korean War also impressed the RAAF with the air superiority qualities of the North American F-86 Sabre. And I don't need to tell you that, of course, it was modified here in Australia to take the Rolls-Royce Avon engine and the Aden cannon. But those modifications delayed the first flight of the Australian Sabre until just after the Korean War ended in 1953. And in fact, it was only in 1955 that 75 Squadron became the first operational unit flying the Avon Sabre. But Australia wasn't the only nation interested in manufacturing the North American Sabre, and Canada was a huge adopter, first building the F-86E variant, and then with the Arenda engine Mark VI, Canadair developed their very own homegrown version. At the same time, the Canadians were really aware of this growth in flight simulator technology, and so they put out a contract to Redifon, which was a British-based company, for 10 Canadair Sabre simulators. 8 of them were static units and 2 were mounted on trailers. And they placed that order in 1952. So Redifon's model C770 was therefore deployed overseas with Canadian Sabre units to the UK and to Germany by 1954. Now that cost the Canadians nearly £1 million British pounds. But on the other hand, that scale of development created an economy that the RAAF was quick to capitalise on. So in January 1953, having watched the Canadian developments, the RAAF issued Operational Requirement OR/Gen 6 for an Avon Sabre flight simulator, which was very heavily based on the Canadian specifications. And Redifon responded with the C773 model, which in turn required some pretty sophisticated gymnastics. So unlike the Link Trainer, which was generic and could be developed pretty much without any reference to anything other than the customer's need for the cockpit layout, simulators required close liaison with the aircraft manufacturer, like North American Aviation, as well as with its operators, particularly the United States Air Force, and then, of course, the RAAF and the Australian manufacturer, Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. All of that, as you can imagine, created a bureaucratic nightmare, particularly given that the Sabre was still a frontline aircraft and its operational capabilities were classed as top secret, not just in Australia, but of course in the United States and in Western Europe as well. So notwithstanding all that complexity, the RAAF ordered 1 static and 1 mobile unit for Australian use. Now, I've never been able to find any pictures of the trailer mounted Avon Sabre. So what I'll have to show you here, it's actually a toy. I think it's a model truck that was shown at Farnborough, the Farnborough Air Show in 1952, of what the Canadian trailer setup would look like for the Sabre. So I'm pretty sure the Australian unit was very similar to that. But if anybody's ever seen a photo of it, I'd love to hear from you. More to the point, of course, this flight simulator represented a conceptual leap in the RAAF's thinking. This was its first true flight simulator. And if you have a look at the plotting device on the left, you'll see what I said before about flight data recorders. I mean, this is a highly sophisticated way of tracking the aircraft's performance and navigational track over space in the early 1950s, well before flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders were fitted into operational aeroplanes. Now, the simulator was very accurate in the sense that it integrated components that were taken off CAC's Sabre production line. But in fact, the Sabre's production and delivery was slowed down by the fact that CAC were working full tilt to deliver actual Sabres to the RAAF. At the same time, that the Air Force had trouble sparing any pilots to evaluate the simulator because they were so busy learning how to fly the real Sabre. So there's a real tension in those early days about which came first. You can see that the Australian Sabre sim also had a frosted canopy, but it also, as you can see at the front of that left picture, had a fairly detailed troubles panel and that plotter that I showed you on the previous image. Finally, however, they were delivered. So the static unit went live at RAAF Williamtown on the 29th of October 1956, and the trailer system was delivered in March 1957, but it was soon deployed over to Butterworth in Malaysia. And the timing of these simulators couldn't have been more perfect. After having had a dropping accident rate in the early 1950s, by 1957, the RAAF's accident rate was 50% higher than it had been just 3 years earlier in 1954. So there was a bit of a crisis evolving again. And that was probably partly because of the introduction of the Sabre, which of course was a massively complex aircraft and escalated decision speeds for the single pilot flying them. And of course, bearing in mind that although there was a twin seat prototype Sabre flown, it never entered operational service in the US or anywhere else as well. So the RAAF was faced with the quandary of how valuable this Sabre simulator might be. They actually spent £192,000 on the static example and £199,000 on the trailer mounted unit. So that's nearly £400,000 for these two sims. But then when you think about it, an Avon Sabre Mark 30 came in at a hefty £340,000 per unit. So effectively they got two simulators for the price of one aeroplane. Now, perhaps prematurely, the Chief of the Air Staff, Air Marshal John Macaulay, felt that the Sabre simulator had already proven itself by the end of 1957. Not everybody was so positive, however, and I'll leave you to read some of the comments that have been gathered both by Group Captain Phil Morrill in his wonderful study of flight simulators in the RAAF, as well as a few ex-Sabre pilots who've spoken to me over the course of my research. So I'll just give you a minute to read these. All right, look, I'm bringing it home here in case you're trying to stay awake out there. I just really want to emphasise, most of this talk tonight has had pretty pictures, but it's actually based on thousands of pages of Air Force documentation. And that's because it was a highly sophisticated project. In fact, the technical requirement for the Avon Sabre simulator was given the designation AC-98, in other words, Aircraft 98. So it was seen as being equivalent to the full introduction of a new aircraft type into the RAAF inventory. But nevertheless, the Sabre simulator was never given an A94 serial number. It was still a valve-operated technology, and the computer power actually filled an entire room behind the simulator unit. But it was still seen by the Air Force as being somewhere between 40 and 60 times cheaper to run than flying an actual Sabre. And I think the other advantage was apparently its serviceability rate was about 80% compared with a standard Sabre on the flight line, which was about 40% serviceability. And the other way the RAAF learned to use the simulator very quickly was forensically as well. So with one of the very first fatal Sabre crashes in 1957, the RAAF ran a whole series of simulations on its simulator and worked out what they thought had happened to the pilot, because they managed to crash the sim in pretty much the same location as A94-940 did. And certainly the RAAF believed in the simulator in the sense that you had to master it before you were allowed to go anywhere near a real Sabre. Having said that, though, the RAAF consulted widely with other Western Air Forces and joined them in deciding that time spent in the simulator didn't reduce the flying time you needed in the real aeroplane before you were qualified on the type. So overall, it's difficult to ascertain the genuine impact of the first RAAF simulator on the Air Force's training and safety record, because it also coincided with an upswing in other safety initiatives like the introduction of this magazine in the middle of the 1950s, particularly through the Directorate of Flying Safety. But it is fair to say that from the time that the Sabre simulators arrived in 1956 and 57, the RAAF safety record improved markedly, and it's never gone anywhere near the dark days of the mid to late 1950s. So unlike the Celestial Navigation Trainer, Redifon's C773 totally convinced the RAAF of the value of this new technology of flight simulators. And it represented both a massive shift in the complexity of training, but also in the cost of these devices as well. So if you look at this chart here, which has a logarithmic scale on the left, you can see the very first link type C cost £1,360 in 1937, whereas the Royal Australian Navy's Grumman S2E tracker simulator from 1970 was the equivalent of £1.2 million. So in other words, it's a 1,000-fold escalation in cost over the course of less than 35 years. And certainly the RAAF itself was convinced, so that in 1958, they convinced the government to pay £315,000 for a Lockheed C-130A simulator from Redifon. And they followed that up then with simulators for the Mirage 330, the Lockheed P3B Orion, and the General Dynamics F111C. Unfortunately, the documentation for those later simulators is almost non-existent, at least in any of the places I've gone looking. So the story is really much harder to pin down from the Sabre onwards. And that's a shame, because there was another massive technological leap at this time, which was the shift to digital computing in the early 1960s. Although, as you can see in the Mirage sim here, there were still no vision systems, although there were increasingly advanced radar and weapon system displays inside the cockpit. So by 1969, the Royal Australian Air Force had gifted one of its Sabre simulators, the one on a trailer, to the Royal Malaysian Air Force, and then retired its own Sabre fleet in 1971. And it was in that same year that the very last Link-style trainers, a pair of D4 Mark Is, were dropped out of the RAAF's inventory. And then in March 1943, the last Avon Sabre simulator left. It went to the Indonesian Air Force, the TNI-AU, in March 1973. And somewhat ironically, it was flown out of the country in the same RAF Shorts Belfast that had brought a Spitfire here. And it was a bit of a shame that that sense of heritage didn't apply to try to preserve the RAAF's first historic flight simulator, which of course is unlike our good friends in the Fleet Air Run who kept theirs. Well, I certainly hope you found that presentation simulating, and I look forward to a chance to have a bit of a chat and hear your questions. Thanks so much.
Peter, thank you very much for your presentation tonight. You're obviously an accomplished speaker, and I did enjoy that very, very much. I also thought that you had a very good selection of illustrations, and you'd obviously done a lot of research on this particular subject. Now, for me, I look at the Link trainer. The only one I've seen in recent times is the one that they've got down at the Newell Air Museum, which I believe they're going to try and get up and running again. Over to you.
Thank you. Just a few comments. In the early 60s, the Air Force had the C-130A simulator, fixed base simulator at Richmond, of course. A cousin of mine was a technical personnel, and he said one of the good things about working for that was it was the only air-conditioned building in RAAF Richmond. Couple of further, and I had a few goes in that C-130 simulator. Later on, regarding Link trainers, Newington College in Sydney had a strong air training corps base out there, and they had a Link trainer at the school. And later on, PAA in Brisbane, PAA had a Link trainer for the Brisbane-based friendship pilots to do some of their license renewal stuff and practice in the sim in Brisbane. Down in Melbourne, they had an ex-Qantas Constellation set up, mocked up to have 2 engines instead of 4 for the Melbourne-based friendship pilots. Thank you.
Thanks, Warwick. It's great to hear about the C-130A simulator. I've found a little bit of documentation about it, but again, like I mentioned, there's very little that seems to survive in the archives. So I was stuck trying to pin down the Herc simulator story by looking through a list of spare parts that has survived in the National Archives, but it did have some dates and delivery times in there. And there was a bit of film footage at the National Archives, which I eagerly went out and watched. To turn out that what they'd done was they'd mounted a camera pointing at the engine RPM dials and filmed those. So there's no actual footage of the outside of the crew using the sim, just the engine dials moving it to simulate the Allisons. Thanks, Peter. Phil Barbara has a question. Phil, you need to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
I'm unmuted now. Thanks, Derek. Peter, what a great presentation as always, and I second Dave's comments about the style with which you do your PowerPoints as well. I think they're terrific. My question, and I know we've talked about this previously, but it's kind of at a philosophical level. You talked about procedures trainers and simulators, and am I right in thinking that your dividing line, if you like, between the two is that a simulator represents an actual aircraft, whereas a procedures trainer is a generic device?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. And I did wonder about putting in a definition as well. Partly the terminology kept shifting over time. And that's one of the things as a historian you've got to be careful about is applying, current day standards back onto the past. So the phrase flight simulator or simulation was sometimes used for some of the post-war link devices, which definitely didn't represent a particular aircraft type. But I think broadly what I tend to say is that a simulator is designed to represent the performance characteristics and layout of an individual aircraft type or even a variant of an aircraft type as well. I think that's a reasonably consistent definition that's applied since the late 1940s now. And so certainly once those sorts of flight simulators came into widespread use by the early 1950s, you see operators like the Royal Australian Air Force and other air forces very pointedly referring to the older style ones as procedural trainers. They use that terminology quite a bit, whereas they may have been tempted to use the phrase simulator before that. Okay, Gordon Clark, go ahead.
Thank you. Just ditto to all the other people before me. Peter, excellent talk. Two things. One, just a matter of a point of information that I might have got wrong. In your talk, you mentioned the USAF was formed in 1948. I had September 1947. Am I wrong, am I? And then, sorry? And the second question...
Right. Yeah, sorry, I should have checked that one. I thought it was maybe legislative in 1947, but yeah, let me get back to you.
Yeah, okay. The other one was you're talking about the Edmondes conversions of the link trainer. Is that, I pronounced it correctly, did I?
I don't know. I've never heard anyone else say it, so that's my guess.
Okay.
It could just be Edmonds, but I did see various different spellings during wartime, but usually they have the ES on the end.
Right. Okay. I'm just wondering, do you know if any are extant in Australia?
Look, it's a good question. I've not seen any that survived. In fact, some of those that were converted to that format seem to have been converted back afterwards. So I should probably put you in touch with Andrew Curtis because he's done a great deal of work. I've noted them whenever I've seen them in the archival record, and I found about 15. But Andrew went through and found he identified up to 32 that appeared to have been converted. Again, the records are a bit dodgy when you go through all the link trainer files. Sometimes they say that a link has been marked for conversion to a deflection trainer, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that conversion was actually put in place as well. But certainly the plan was to have them available at most of the major fighter stations. I think some of them even deployed up into New Guinea as well, sort of late in the war as well. So look, I'm going with Andrew's research on this, but I would say there was about 32, but it's possible that that adaptation was then taken off when they were sold onto the market afterwards, because they were mostly, from what I can see, it was the D model rather than the D2, and it was the D models that the RAAF was selling off in 1947.
Right, excellent. Thanks very much, Peter.
Peter Dunn has his hand up. Go ahead, Peter Dunn.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent talk, Peter. Mine's a comment rather than a question. When I was going to school in Townsville in 1965, 1966, doing sub-senior and senior, our school was in the sort of near the city, above the city area on Stanton Hill. And after school, me and my mate used to go down to RAAF recruiting headquarters in Sturt Street, which was also the headquarters for the Air Training Corps. And I was in number 1 flight, ATC at that point in time at Garbutt. And we used to go down the basement. We'd ask permission, could we fly the Link trainer? And we did it quite often, many times, and all self-taught. And many years later, when I visited the RAAF Heritage Centre at Garbutt, I noticed they had one there operating, and it's probably the same one, but I couldn't be certain of that. I'm not sure that it's in there operating at the moment, but it was probably 8 or 10 years ago. And during one of my visits, I managed to donate to them a operating manual for the Link trainer, which someone had given me that at work. I don't know how he got it, but yeah, so that's my little story. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Really appreciated you being there. And yeah, look, when I've gone back through the archives, the Air Training Corps became a real problem for the RAAF. They had to keep trying to find technicians who even knew how to keep the links operational, to keep the AirTC links flying in the late 1960s and into the 1970s as well. They were just running out of parts, but also running out of expertise by that stage as well.
Yeah, we fixed this one a few times.
I know the Airways Museum has a Link trainer manual as well, which because Phil's kindly scanned some pages of it for me. So. Richard, I think you were next.
Peter, 2 questions. Are you able to easily go back to any of the slides that you showed?
Sure, should be able to. Can you remember which one that you're interested in?
Yeah, it's the watercolour painting of the bomber crash.
Oh, yes, the Frank Hinder one. Yep, let me just bring it up.
I found it hard to understand what the painting was depicting.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let me show you. So I think, this is, classic modernist art, so it's meant to be a bit abstract, but I think what you can see there is the actual painting is the one on the right of the screen, and then on the left of the screen are the 4 sort of preliminary sketches or studies he did. So I think what you can see in those is that was a bit more of a literal interpretation of what he saw. If you see, there's a little pencil note down the bottom. It says crash Rabaul.
Yes.
So I reckon that's what he must have witnessed, and then he turned that into a more abstract representation on the right. And I think, I don't know, I've looked at this a few times, and I think, sadly, I reckon that the shapes in the sort of the middle there are probably the air crew that you can see in the circular design on the left panel. But yeah, that's my way of reading it anyway. But yeah, it was reasonably abstract World War II art, that's for sure.
Is it meant to be a liberator?
Yeah, it could have been Liberator or maybe a Mitchell. Hard to say, really, but yeah.
And Peter, I've got another comment, please. On ABV2 in the
bit hot, so.
On ABV2 in the early 1960s, there was an amusing article on Weekend magazine, which was shown on a Sunday night. And it showed this farmer in rural New South Wales, and he'd made a Link trainer out of a 44-gallon drum, added wings to it, a tailplane, a streamlined nose and a propeller, and it was hanging. You could sit inside this 44-gallon drum, and it was hanging from the centre of gravity, you see, and he would get into it on a windy day and pretend that he was in an aircraft. But it was quite an amusing episode of Weekend magazine. I've often thought in another life, if I had a farm, I'd set something up like that, hanging from a beam, and you could do a lot with it.
Yep. I can imagine that. Look, there were a few of those sorts of very, very basic stick and rudder type devices that were used. mean, the Air Force did actually adopt a series of those for like the very basic preliminary evaluation of potential aircrew. I think it was one of those that got me into trouble when I wanted to join the RAAF as a pilot in the late 80s. So yeah, there are some very simple devices that can assess very simple skills, and yeah, I didn't do too well on those. Maybe I should have been a farmer as well. I think Phil was the next, and then Gordon.
Well, I saw Phil and Richard and Gordon still have their hands raised. I'm not sure if that means
well,
they've got a question or if they forgot to unraise them.
Phil is late.
I did have a
If
question.
anyone else hasn't got a question.
Go ahead, Gordon.
Thank you very much. I'll just lower my hand. Peter, I was wondering if you, I saw the restoration and rebuilding of 2 linked trainers in the Nil Aviation Historical Centre in Victoria. Were you aware of those restorations and that one of them is now working in that centre?
No, but I'd love to go and see it. I haven't been keeping track of the latest ones, but I don't actually know where all the current links are around Australia, which is, I know, obviously ADF Serials has been my first port of call. Yep, but yeah, it'd be nice to get out to Nil to check it out. That's for sure.
It's definitely worth doing. They've done an excellent job on it, and they spent several years working on that link trainer, and he did 2. He did 2 at the same time. So.
Yeah. And just on the ADF serial side, we're always looking for updates because links do have a habit of moving around the countryside. So
yes, yes, indeed.
Yeah. Well, they used to come with a little packing crate and could actually be put on wheels as well and moved around. I've seen some photos of that in the archival files as well. It was a very neat little setup, actually, the way you could transport them around the country.
Andrew.
Peter, firstly, magnificent presentation. I must have slipped through the cracks in the late 80s because I did manage to get my wings, and I was just looking at my pilot's logbook, and I spent basically the 90s flying Hercules. So I thought, if you're interested, following up from the C-130A simulator, I actually broke into a cold sweat when I actually opened up Record of Flight Simulator Practices. It's a bit hard to read here, I'm sorry about that.
No.
And I've just counted up 147 sessions in the E model, C-130E and C-130H. On average, we were tortured anywhere between about 1 and 3.5 hours, except for the last page when I was head of training and then I got to do the torturing. And 99.4 hours of torturing poor students as the head of C-130 training. But just to maybe add to your definition of flight simulators, the E-model simulator was a fixed-base simulator, so procedural training for pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer. No motion and no visuals. So we would do emergencies, we would fly instrument approaches, exercise crew resource management, which you mentioned earlier on as well. And then the last 200 feet at the bottom of the instrument approach was unassessed because it was just a guess and a giggle, and you landed the aeroplane. Moving on to from the E to the H model, it was a full motion simulator. It had what we call dusk visuals, very much just a dark screen with dot points of light. And you could, for want of a better term, simulate a landing. My last gig before I left the Air Force as a reservist was we got a new H model sim, new level 3, level 5 sim. Anyway, what we would now call a full flight sim, whereby full visuals, et cetera, and now, of course, the C-130J simulator, that's the all singing, all dancing full flight sim that we're used to in the airlines and that now. So yeah, just thought I'd like to share that with you. But yeah, wonderful presentation.
Oh, great. No, thanks. Well, thanks for sharing that as well, because I was wondering, I sort of stopped by the time I got to the 1970s with my research, partly because the records are so skimpy. But yeah, that's interesting to hear about the different Herc sims. I know the F-111 sim had a motion system. That was a Singer Link simulator. And Qantas actually pioneered both the movement system and the visual systems with their 707 sims. over time. Although the problem was when they bolted the vision system, the very heavy television vision system on the front of the 707 sim, it actually threw out the motion system as well. So they could have one or the other, but not both. So yeah, that took a lot of recalibration to do. That was in the sort of mid to late 60s as well. So
yeah. It was interesting to see in my 15 years to see the transition from no visuals and no motion to full motion, full visuals.
And certainly by the mid 60s, a simulator was seen as an essential part of the whole aircraft procurement package as well.
Yeah, and actually, interestingly, finishing my time up as the training flight commander at 36 Squadron, the pressure really mounted on us. The simulators weren't quite up to it, but we used to do about 50% of the training in the simulator and 50% of the training in the aircraft. Very much procedures, checklists in the simulator and some basic hands and flying skills. And then you put it into practice in the aircraft because the simulator still didn't quite feel like the aircraft. The representation in front of you was accurate, but the fidelity, the actual muscle memory, it didn't really help you so much. But within the decade I was there, and at the end, the pressure, as the newer simulators arrived, the pressure was really on from above to do effectively 100% of our training in simulators, which personally at that stage still wasn't possible. I met them in the middle and I gave them about 75% in the simulator and 25% in the aircraft when I put together the final syllabus and training package for the C-130H. But for instance, for me now as a Qantas pilot, our first flight in the aircraft can be with commercial passengers sitting behind us. Yes, we still have a trainer with us just in case, but and we do between 6 and 8 sectors in the sectors under supervision in the aircraft. But yeah, they have come a long way in my 35 years of flying.
Yeah, no, that's impressive to hear. I mean, it's alarming in some ways too, but obviously it just does speak to the fidelity of the simulators, which every new type of trainer or simulator that came along claimed to be just like the real thing, and then of course the next one came along or the next version comes along and the next software upgrade comes along and they say, now it's really authentic, and that old version, well, that really wasn't all that good. So, you do wonder where it will end. But one of the other things I didn't mention about simulators that became really important, and obviously the RAAF had a very tragic experience of this, of the 707 out of East Sale, was that simulators gave aircrew and aircraft designers, as well as trainers, the opportunity to take the aircraft, or at least the simulator, out beyond the bounds of its performance envelope as well. They could actually test what might happen if you did this in a real aeroplane, and then what responses you might be able to model. So in fact, in a sense, it went beyond simulation into anticipation, and it gave trainers certainly the opportunity to come up with procedures to deal with scenarios that hadn't been dealt with before, such as wildly asymmetric flight and so on as well. So, and I think that's been one of their many advantages. Again, I speak as a non-pilot, but it seems to be one of their major advantages as well, is being able to model and test out and practice your responses to situations that you hopefully will never encounter in the air. So interesting.
Yes, I think my engine failures in the Herc sim equaled my engine failures in the actual Herc, but luckily I've had 0 engine failures at Qantas, but plenty in the simulator. In fact, funnily enough, the simulators are usually a little bit harder to fly than the aircraft, which is a good thing. It's the old train hard, fight easy sort of philosophy.
Another question from Phil Vibray.
Thank you. I feel a bit like Dr. Evil here with the cat I'm petting, but my question actually follows on a bit from what you were just talking about with Andrew there. One of the fundamental questions of simulation is, what are you trying to achieve with it? And I'm wondering, you talked sort of briefly about the new generation of simulation that came along after the Sabre, the C-130A, the P3 and the Tracker, but also the Mirage. And the Mirage obviously had some weapon system radar modelling. So it was presumably designed to train some of that aspect of it, not just flying the aeroplane. So I'm wondering how much documentation, because you've looked at a lot, obviously, how much was devoted to what do we want this thing to actually do, and how much of it was, well, we need a simulator, and this is what it should look like.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I have to admit that I'm a bit stumped by anything after the Avon Sabre. I found it really hard to find a lot of documentation, but the Avon Sabre is a really interesting point. I'll come back to the others in a minute. So the original operational specification for the Sabre simulator was pretty brief. It was about 12 pages, and it was based on the RCAF one for the Canadair Sabre. Once they actually started playing around with it and testing the example that was being developed in England, they came up with a second version of the spec that went out to about 35 pages. And it had a lot more detail about the fidelity, about, it needed to have the screech of the tires and the sound of the cannon thumping, and needed to have a whole series of faults, like, not just flame outs, but various control failures and whatever in the system as well. So my feeling is that the Air Force was still edging their way around what was this thing and what might it help them do. So they were actually, in some ways, the specifications seemed to be more closely matched to the capabilities of the simulator than the other way around, if that makes sense. That the specs were following the device rather than responding to the specifications. So by the 1960s, I imagine the documentation was much, much more complicated, but I just haven't seen that. But I certainly know that, for instance, with the Orion, yes, there was a flight simulator, but there was a whole weapons system station simulator as well. And the Mirage had a range of, I think, ground attack and air-to-air mission simulators inside the main simulation system. And certainly the F-111 sim had TACAN and all sorts of attack systems in it, which were certainly in the initial stages geared towards the Southeast Asian theatre for fairly obvious reasons as well. So, but I did amusingly read a Singer Link report from 1979 about the F-111C simulator, which was that pilots were complaining that they could fly it through hills. And the Link representatives felt that was not a good thing. So again, we come back to that issue of fidelity and just how real is the sim actually to what the real aeroplane is meant to be doing.
Richard, Hannes, go ahead.
Peter, I was in error when I said that this farmer's arrangement that was hanging from a beam could do a lot of things. Of course, it can't do a lot of things, but it's so cheap to make, and just imagine how children would enjoy that in a strong wind. It costs less than $50 to make, and yet give a lot of pleasure to not only children, but some adults. I just wanted to add that point.
Thanks, Richard. The budget is always important, isn't it? Roderick, go ahead.
Right, thanks. You did mention civilian applications fairly early. They picked up some of the second-hand RAAF equipment. Overall, was civilian ahead of military in developing simulators, or was military ahead of civilian as the years went by?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I've given other presentations on sims where I've mixed the two up, because I try to actually make that very point that the RAAF didn't exist in a vacuum. But given the nature of tonight's seminar, I focused on Air Force applications. Look, they really tended to go hand in hand. And of course, you can't overlook the importance of the United States Air Force and to some extent the United States Navy in driving simulator development. So to give a couple of examples, the first serious commercial flight simulator was for Boeing Stratocruiser, the 377 model. And that really came out of the fact that the US Air Force was funding development of the Boeing B-50 and C-97 simulators as well. So of course, they were the same basic airframe, depending whether it had a single or double bubble. But there's no doubt that Pan Am and then BOAC, who adopted those Stratocruiser simulators, were banking on the huge amount of money that US Air Force was putting into its later piston bombers and transports and then refueling aircraft. By the time you get to the early 60s, it's a bit neck and neck. So, for instance, the Redifon, who I spoke about, they developed a 3-axis motion system for their Comet 4 simulator by about 1958, I think, something like that, which was a huge advance. And then there were vision systems coming online not long after that. Link, which later became Singer Link in America, by about 1961-62 was experimenting with 6-axis motion systems. It pioneered those actually on one of its Hercules sims, but was also very much looking at the Electra, the Lockheed Electra, and Boeing 707 simulators as well. So the early vision systems were certainly pioneered for the airlines in about 1962, but I still haven't seen a lot of detail. Like, as far as I know, there's no solid book on the development of flight simulators over their full history, and certainly not from the 1960s. So I could be missing things in there. But to answer your question, my feeling is the airlines probably pushed the envelope a little harder, especially after 1950. But of course, the air forces were probably trying to get their simulators to do many more things than the airlines were in terms of all the weapons system and nav system integrations that weren't required for civilian flying.
The second half of the same bit then, really both of them are governed by available computer power. You have to be able to drive, because you made that point a few minutes ago. Does the spec drive the simulator, or does the simulator drive the spec? It was the available technology being pushed to its limits, and you had to get better technology before you could get better simulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think it's often forgotten that those early flight simulators, so that Demel style stuff that was being developed in the middle of World War II, which, like I said, also came out of attempts to rapidly calculate artillery and naval fire control and anti-aircraft systems. All of them were trying to plot all the potential courses that an aircraft could take, or that a projectile could take, and allow for all sorts of performance parameters and wind and wear on gun barrels and all sorts of things. So that sort of computing technology helped drive early analog and then electronic computing. And certainly flight simulators were at the forefront of driving that sort of technology. But yeah, as you say, it's a bit of a chicken and egg as well. You know, is it how powerful can our computers be, and what can we get them to do with the flight sim? And then, you know, how much do we need in the flight sim, and what can the computers help us do even better?
Great, thanks.
I'll just throw one in. As ever, great presentation, Peter. Just interested in your other look at this. Did you, in your research, did you take in other kinds of procedural trainers, such as escape trainers, like the dreaded Dilbert Dunker?
Look, I kept track of other sorts of trainers, like the navigation trainers and the bombing teachers, and a little bit about the radar training devices and so on. But it started to get too diffuse, I guess. You know, it started to get too, I mean, to the point where, quite seriously, there are several files of the wartime RAAF that talked about training aids, which actually came down to clay pigeons and shotguns. You know, and quite seriously, the RAAF was ordering them for its bases just to keep the fighter pilots' eyes in as well. I thought, I get the feeling I'm going a bit off track here when I get down to that level as well. So, yeah, look, there were a whole range of other devices that I could have been looking at, but I sort of drew lines around things that were attempting to replicate flying.
Very cool.
Gordon again.
Yes, I'll try and make this my last one, Peter. I've got it probably won't come out too well. I have a logbook here, and there's several logbooks, and you mentioned in passing about the pilots' attitudes to them. And I noticed in a lot of the logbooks, most of my logbooks from World War II are from 78 Squadron. And this one in particular is by Bill Henry. And he in his original logbook, lists the link trainers and that, but never adds up the hours or anything like that. And then at some time after the war, he went out and bought another logbook and wrote in there the, I guess for clarity reasons, wrote it all again, except he left out all the link trainer stuff. So quite a few of them did that. I mean, not necessarily set a second logbook, but in the original logbook, it was just treated as a side issue and nothing more.
Yeah, look, I agree. I've looked at a bunch of logbooks in the same sort of way, and I think my feeling is that you sometimes see a little table added into a pilot's logbook specifically for link trainer hours. Sometimes they'll add an extra column over on the right-hand side and put it in rather tentatively. I thought I'd seen some late war examples where the link trainer hours were actually printed as an official column in the logbook. But there was also then specific link trainer logbooks and link trainer instructor logbooks as well. And the RAAF Museum has a couple of those. So, the instructors themselves would also keep track of who they'd had in their trainer doing what as well. So that was getting back to Andrew's comment about being the chief torturer. I think they took a certain amount of pleasure from that as well. But I found that really interesting too. I've seen a couple of examples where they don't bother adding up their link time, which is interesting because during the war, and I've documented this, the RAAF at various stages stipulated the number of hours of link time you had to accumulate at an initial training school and an elementary flying training school and a service flying training school, as well as at, I think, the amount of time that non-flying personnel had to spend and instructors had to spend in links as well. Sometimes it was like 10 or 15 hours, or sometimes it was, 6 hours a month or something like that. So there were specific limits that were meant to be flown in the link. But I very rarely see people bothering to actually add up those hours. And so, mind you, on the other hand, I don't see them putting any black marks against the links. So.
Right, fair enough.
And it looks like another question from Phil.
Thanks. Actually, more of perhaps a follow-on comment about logbooks. And I'm just endorse what you said, Peter. I think as some people will know, I'm a bit of a student of logbooks. And I suspect that because early on link hours were not counted towards anything, except maybe the syllabus of training for a course or something, which would have been recorded in the training, the course notes or course records. But in terms of qualifying you in flying hours in the way of flying in actual aeroplanes it didn't have any effect. So therefore there was no need to record them in a logbook. Whereas in fact, RAAF logbooks from that time allowed, or in fact instructed you to record passenger hours in your logbook. So that was considered important from an experience point of view, but link hours weren't. And it wasn't until later on, as I think Gordon mentioned, that logbooks came with a column for recording simulated hours. And now, of course, they're counted towards your experience. So people do record simulator hours. So I think that's really the explanation for it.
Thanks, Phil. Interesting. We're going to wrap it up at this point, so I'll hand back to Dave Prosser.
So, Peter, once again, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. You're a great speaker, and when you start that lecture school, I'm booking the #1 ticket on that one. And from the other members of the AHSA here and Zoom, I know we all thank you very much for a great talk this evening. Once again, thank you.